If you saw an old man standing alone in the middle of a frost-covered cemetery, clutching a leash with no dog at the end, what would you think? To most passers-by, he looked like just another broken veteran caught in a memory. But if you looked closely, you'd see the tremble in his hand wasn't from the cold, it was grief. His name was Frank Delaney, 73 years old, a retired Marine who had outlived two wives, a brother, and most recently, his service dog, Gunner. Every morning since the burial, Frank still walked the same route they had taken for 8 years, ending at Gunner's final resting place. He whispered the same words every time, "Wait for me, buddy," before sitting in silence for hours. To him, there was unfinished business. He never got to say goodbye the way Gunner deserved. His heart wasn't done, but his time was running out. What he didn't know was that something had been following him, something with amber eyes and a limp, something waiting for its own kind of goodbye. Frank's life had shrunk to a narrow rhythm since Gunner passed. He barely spoke to neighbors. His meals came from the microwave or not at all. The walls of his home were filled with pictures, most of them military, some of his wife, but the largest wall was a collage of Gunner. The shepherd had come into his life after a botched knee surgery from his third deployment left Frank with chronic pain and anxiety attacks. Gunner had saved him from darkness more than once. He was more than a dog, he was a reason. And when Gunner's kidneys failed just before Christmas, Frank didn't even cry at the vet's office. He held him in silence, kissed the side of his face, and whispered, "Semper Fi, soldier." That was the last word he spoke out loud for nearly 4 days. Each morning, Frank's boots crunched over gravel and frost as he made the walk to the edge of McPherson Woods, where a small pet cemetery stood behind a wrought iron gate. There, under a maple tree, lay Gunner. Frank sat on the bench beside the headstone, eyes fixed on the carved name. He never stayed less than an hour. Locals sometimes spotted him from the highway and slowed down, watching the old soldier and the wind-blown leaves as if in a scene from another era. But no one dared approach. Frank radiated something between reverence and heartbreak, a man at war with time itself. That morning, the sky was thick with low gray clouds, the kind that pressed down on your chest. Frank moved slower than usual, stopping twice to catch his breath. He was thinking, again, about writing a letter to Gunner, maybe reading it aloud at the grave. Something about that felt right. He had seen a video online once about soldiers writing letters to their fallen comrades. Gunner had worn his own little vest, carried IDs, even had a badge. He was a soldier, too. "You deserve that, buddy," Frank muttered under his breath. But as he stepped through the gate and into the clearing, he froze. The bench was knocked over. It wasn't the wind, he could tell by the paw prints in the thin layer of frost. Big ones, not Gunner's, not quite. The track circled the headstone, pacing back and forth, and then veered off toward the woods. Frank's gut clenched. He scanned the tree line. Silence. Nothing moved. His first thought was a coyote or stray dog, but he didn't hear the usual signs, no rustling, no panting. Then, a soft whine pierced the cold. It came from beyond the woods, where the snow thickened. Something was out there, something alive, hurting, and maybe waiting. Frank hesitated. His mind raced with possibilities: injured animal, someone's lost pet, maybe even a wild wolf. But then came another sound, softer, closer. It was like nails scratching wood. He turned slowly and saw a shape in the shadows, half hidden behind the gnarled roots of a fallen tree. Eyes met his, deep, amber, filled with pain. It was a dog, but not just any dog. Thin, ragged, limping. But there was something familiar in the way it tilted its head. Frank's chest tightened. He took a cautious step forward. The dog flinched but didn't run. Its coat was dirty, matted, with patches of raw skin showing through. Its ribs stuck out like piano keys. Around its neck hung a tattered piece of red fabric, maybe a collar once. Frank's voice cracked as he spoke. "Hey there, buddy." For a second, it felt like Gunner had returned in some impossible form. But this wasn't Gunner. This was something broken, alone, watching, waiting. As Frank knelt, the dog lowered its head but didn't move. Inches apart, they studied each other. Frank reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out the leftover jerky he always carried to the cemetery, a habit he couldn't break. He offered it with an open palm. The dog sniffed the air, shuffled closer, and gently took the piece, then retreated a step. Frank sat back against the bench, heart pounding. It was like watching a ghost. Something about the eyes, the way they didn't beg, didn't plead, just waited. Minutes passed. Then, the dog limped forward and lay down beside Gunner's grave. Not beside Frank, not under a tree, right beside the headstone. Frank watched in disbelief as the dog rested its chin on the cold stone, as if it belonged there. Tears welled in Frank's eyes for the first time in weeks. He looked up at the gray sky, then down at the strange visitor. "Who are you?" he whispered, almost afraid of the answer. The dog didn't move, it just lay there, guarding the grave like it had always known this place. Something shifted inside Frank. He couldn't explain it, but a quiet voice inside him said, "This isn't coincidence." This dog didn't just show up, it came to this place, this grave, for a reason. Whether it was fate or something else, he didn't care. He stood up slowly, knees aching, and said aloud, "I'm not leaving you here." The dog raised its head, ears twitching. Frank opened his coat wide, stepping forward. The cold wind whipped around them as the dog hesitated, then leaned in. The walk back was slow. The dog limped beside him, and sure, but didn't stray. Frank said nothing, too choked up to form words. When they reached the house, he opened the door, and the dog stepped in like it had always lived there. It stopped in front of Gunner's portrait, stared at it for several seconds, then curled up on the mat below. Frank stood frozen. A moment passed, then another. And then, for the first time since Gunner died, he whispered, "Welcome home." But neither of them knew the real story was just beginning. The next morning, something strange happened. Frank awoke before dawn, drenched in sweat, heart racing. He had dreamed of the war his unit ambushed in Fallujah, the sound of gunfire, the screams. But this time, Gunner wasn't beside him like in the old nightmares. This time, the limping dog was there, standing in the smoke, watching. When Frank sat up, he found the dog already awake, staring at him from across the room. It felt like a warning, or a memory. Something about this dog was unraveling something old and buried deep. Frank couldn't shake the feeling. As he made coffee, he kept looking over his shoulder, expecting the dog to vanish like some grief-born hallucination. But it didn't. It stayed. Quiet, alert, and always watching him. He sat down at the table with his cup and whispered, "You saw something, didn't you?" The dog cocked its head slightly, like it understood. Frank didn't believe in ghosts, but he was starting to believe in something else, something worse, something forgotten. He poured a second bowl of water, one for Gunner, one for the stranger. The dog's limp worsened by mid-morning. Frank gently inspected the paw and found an old wound, likely infected. He debated calling animal control, but something in his gut said no. This dog needed more than medicine, it needed trust. He wrapped the paw with a clean bandage, using skills he'd learned long ago in the field. The dog didn't flinch, just watched him with those same quiet eyes. Frank felt something crack open in his chest. He hadn't touched another living thing since the day he buried Gunner. And now here he was healing someone else. Later that day, as Frank sat on the porch with the dog beside him, a neighbor walked by and stopped in shock. "Is that Gunner?" she asked. Frank shook his head. "No, but he found me, just like Gunner did." The woman nodded slowly and kept walking, but Frank saw the confusion in her eyes. He felt it too. Who was this dog? Why here? Why now? He didn't have answers, only questions, and the sense that everything was about to change. Frank hadn't planned on keeping the dog, but by the third day, he'd already caught himself humming while refilling its bowl. Something was shifting in the house. There was movement again, sounds of nails tapping on the floor, bowls clinking, even a tail thumping softly against furniture. He hadn't realized how quiet the house had become until now. The dog, who he began calling Shadow without thinking much about it, followed him from room to room. Not out of fear or need, but as if guarding him. Frank felt it in his bones. This wasn't a pet. This was a companion, a witness. The wound on Shadow's paw was worse than he thought. When Frank finally took a closer look under better light, he noticed signs of older injury, scars along the ribcage, a torn ear, and a faint burn mark near the back leg. Someone had hurt this animal, deliberately. The rage that bubbled in Frank's gut was hot and immediate. He had seen men do things like that in war zones, to dogs, to each other. It was the kind of violence that leaves more than physical scars. And now, one of its victims was lying at his feet, eyes closed, trusting him. That trust cut deeper than any weapon ever had. The local vet, Dr. Maggie Pierce, knew Frank well. She'd treated Gunnar in his last days, had even offered to be there during the final injection. When Frank called her about Shadow, her voice was cautious. "Frank, are you sure you want to take this on? He's not a rescue case, he's trauma incarnate." But Frank was already loading the dog into the back seat, his hand steady on the fur. "So am I," he said. "That's why I'm doing it." Maggie agreed to meet them at the clinic, no questions asked. She understood. They all did. Frank wasn't saving the dog. The dog was saving him again. At the clinic, Shadow was silent as Maggie examined him. No growling, no fear, just quiet endurance. "He's been through hell," she said, peeling back a scab, "nerve damage, starvation. And based on these scars, maybe even underground fighting." Frank clenched his fists. He thought of Gunnar again, how loyal he was, how proud. And now here was another soldier, of a different kind, carrying invisible medals of pain. "Can he heal?" Frank asked. Maggie nodded slowly. "Physically, yes. Emotionally, that depends." They locked eyes. Neither needed to say more. On the ride home, Frank took a longer route through the woods. It had started to snow lightly, dusting the trees in white. Shadow sat upright in the back seat, alert but calm. Frank glanced at him through the mirror and said, "You're not just a dog, are you?" The dog blinked slowly, eyes heavy with meaning. "You came to me for a reason. I don't know what it is yet. But I'm not letting go." That night, Frank lit the fireplace for the first time in years. Shadow lay curled at his feet, and Frank, wrapped in an old marine blanket, whispered, "You're safe now." By the end of the week, word had gotten around town. People saw Frank walking again, this time with the dog by his side. Some thought it was Gunnar returned from the dead. Others believed Frank had finally adopted. But no one could explain the change in him. His gait was steadier, his eyes had life again. At the diner, he even smiled. It wasn't just about companionship, it was about redemption. The kind that comes only when two wounded souls find each other in the wreckage and decide to rebuild. Together, then came the call. Maggie rang Frank 2 days later, her voice serious. "I ran Shadow's microchip," she said. "You need to hear this in person." Frank's stomach dropped. When he arrived, she handed him a printed report. Shadow's real name was Brutus. He had belonged to a man currently under investigation for illegal animal fighting rings. The details were gruesome. Frank didn't want to read them, but he did. Every line deepened the hole in his chest. Brutus had escaped 3 months ago during a police raid. No one knew how he'd survived in the cold. Until now. Frank sat in silence, hands trembling. "If the authorities find out he's with you, they might take him," Maggie warned. "Technically, he's evidence." Frank's voice was low but firm. "Over my dead body." Maggie placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then you'll need to fight. You'll need proof he's better off here. That he's not just a case file." Frank nodded slowly. For years, he'd avoided conflict, hidden from the world. But now, he had something worth fighting for again. And he wasn't going to lose another soldier under his watch. He began documenting everything: feeding schedules, medicine, training exercises. He recorded videos of Shadow responding to his voice, walking steadily, even wagging his tail. Every little improvement felt like a small miracle, but it was more than that. It was evidence. Not just to the authorities, but to Frank himself, that this mattered, that he mattered. He cleaned the house, reopened the back porch, and even called his daughter in Oregon for the first time in months. "I have a dog again," he told her, and she cried, not because of the dog, but because her father sounded alive again. But nothing stayed peaceful for long. One morning, a black SUV appeared outside Frank's house. 2 men in dark jackets stepped out, flashing badges. "Animal welfare agents. We're here about a dog," one of them said. Frank stood tall, the leash wrapped firmly around his hand. "You're not taking him," the agent sighed. "Sir, he's legally tied to an ongoing investigation. If you interfere, you could be charged." Frank didn't blink. "I've faced worse." Shadow stood beside him, tail still, eyes locked on the agent's. For a moment, there was silence. Then one of them stepped back. "We'll be in touch." Frank knew what that meant. The clock was ticking. Shadow wasn't just in danger of being taken, he could be euthanized if labeled too damaged. Frank couldn't let that happen. He contacted a lawyer who worked pro bono with veterans. He reached out to a reporter who'd once interviewed him about PTSD. He told Shadow's story every detail. "This isn't about a dog," he said. "It's about what we throw away because it makes us uncomfortable. Pain, trauma, beings." The reporter listened, eyes wide. Then nodded. "I'll publish it. People need to know." The article went live 3 days later, From Warzone to Redemption, the dog who found a soldier's heart. Within hours, it was shared across veteran forums, rescue networks, even local news. Photos of Shadow lying beside Gunner's grave, Frank kneeling beside him, lit up the screen. Comments poured in, some with tears, others with rage. Donations arrived, letters too. One from a young boy who wrote, "I was scared too, but your dog made me brave." Frank read it aloud to Shadow, who wagged his tail once, slowly. The next time the agents returned, they didn't come alone. A state officer accompanied them, but this time, they weren't there to confiscate Shadow. Instead, they handed Frank a letter. It was from the DA's office. "Due to overwhelming public support and proof of rehabilitation, Shadow is hereby released from custody and granted permanent residence with Mr. Frank Delaney." Frank's knees nearly buckled. Shadow leaned into his leg, pressing close. The agent saluted him before turning away. "He's lucky to have you," he said. Frank shook his head. "We saved each other." That night, Frank brought out Gunner's old vest. It was faded, the patches worn. Carefully, he attached a new tag, Shadow Service Companion. He slipped it gently onto the dog, who stood still, proud. Frank saluted him. "At ease, soldier." Outside, snow fell softly again, covering the ground in a clean white sheet. Frank stepped out onto the porch, Shadow at his side. He looked up at the sky, at the stars just beginning to appear, and whispered, "Thank you for sending him, buddy." Somewhere deep in the woods, an owl called out. And in that sound, Frank swore he heard Gunner's bark just once. Then silence. Frank never thought he'd put a vest on another dog again. Gunner's had been retired with a folded flag and a tear-stained salute. But Shadow stood in front of him now, strong and still healing, wearing that same symbol with a quiet dignity that made Frank's throat tighten. The new tag clinked softly as the dog moved through the hallway, no longer limping. Day by day, Shadow was becoming more than a survivor, he was transforming. And so was Frank. His morning routine no longer ended at Gunner's grave. It began there, with 2 names now, not 1. The change in the neighborhood was just as real. People who had once crossed the street when they saw Frank coming now waved from their porches. Some even stopped to talk. Children pointed at Shadow and smiled. The bravest ones asked to pet him, and to everyone's surprise, Shadow allowed it. He lowered his head, let them stroke his back, and then sat still beside Frank, like a sentinel. For years, Frank had been invisible, a ghost in his own town. Now, he was something else entirely, a man walking with purpose, no longer just surviving. Frank began volunteering again at the local veteran center. At first, it was just small things, carrying boxes, checking security cameras. But the director noticed the difference. "You've got light in your eyes again," she said. He just nodded. "It's not mine," he replied. "It's his." He brought Shadow along one afternoon, just to see how he'd react. The dog stayed close but calm, even among wheelchairs and sudden noises. One young Marine in a dark hoodie stared at Shadow for a long time before saying, "He looks like mine," before he got taken. And just like that, a conversation began. The 2 of them became fixtures at the center. Shadow lay at the foot of therapy chairs during group sessions, sometimes resting his head on someone's knee without prompting. Frank told his story one afternoon, hesitantly at first. Then fully. "I didn't plan to keep living," he admitted. "Not after Gunner. But Shadow showed up, broken as I was. And he didn't ask for anything except to stay." The room was silent. One man wiped his eyes. Another whispered, "That's the whole damn point, isn't it?" That night, Frank sat with Shadow on the porch and simply said, "We're doing it, somehow." Then came the call from his daughter, Ellie. It had been nearly a year since their last real conversation. "I saw the news clip," she said. "You looked. Well, you didn't look lost." Frank chuckled. "I'm not," he said. "Not anymore." She asked to visit. "I'd like to meet him." "I think the kids need to see that kind of strength," Frank agreed, cautiously hopeful. When she arrived with her 2 boys in tow, Shadow didn't bark or hide. He sniffed, sat, and let them come to him. Ellie stared, stunned. "He's calm, grounded, Frank smiled. Yeah, so my Shadow's presence started drawing attention beyond their town. A local documentary filmmaker reached out, wanting to tell their story. Frank hesitated. I'm not looking for a spotlight, he said. But when the woman explained it could help other veterans, others like Shadow, he agreed. The interview was raw. Frank spoke of war, loss, and silence. He spoke of Gunner's last day, and how a stranger's eyes pulled him back from the edge. When asked what Shadow had given him, he replied simply, permission, to keep going, to feel again, to love something without fear of losing it. The documentary went viral in weeks. Messages came from everywhere: Germany, Alaska, even South Korea. A former soldier wrote, I buried my K9 last year. You made me believe I could open the door again. Another said, Shadow looks like my dog after we escaped the kennel fights. I named mine Mercy. Frank read each one, tears streaming. He printed the letters, taped them to the wall where Gunner's photos once dominated. Now, the space held both stories: Gunner's silent honor and Shadow's loud survival, two halves of one journey. Shadow continued to surprise him. He'd begun responding to basic commands again: stay, sit, come, but there were moments when he did more. When Frank had a panic episode one night, cold sweat pouring, heart racing, Shadow climbed into bed and lay against his chest. No command, just instinct, and the pressure of his body steadied Frank's breath, like Gunner used to do. The next morning, Frank looked into those amber eyes and whispered, how do you know what I need? The dog didn't answer, of course. But his tail thumped once, and that was enough. One afternoon, Frank brought Shadow to the memorial wall in town. The names etched in stone included friends, brothers in arms, and memories he didn't dare relive often. But he stood there now, shoulder to shoulder with Shadow, and for the first time, he said aloud, we made it, boys. An older man nearby saluted Frank and asked, that your new partner? Frank looked down, his eyes misting. Yeah, the best kind. He doesn't talk, but he listens better than anyone I've ever met. The man smiled. Sounds like you finally got your goodbye, Frank nodded. Maybe, or maybe a second chance, but the past always finds a way to test the present. One rainy evening, Frank received another letter. This time, it was from a state legal office, a follow-up to the original investigation into Shadow's abuser. A court date has been scheduled, it read. You may be asked to testify. Frank's hands shook, not from fear but from fury. They want me to relive it, he said to himself. Fine. He turned to Shadow, who was curled by the fire. We'll make sure they know what pain looks like. And what healing does too. He would not let this go quietly. Preparing to testify brought nightmares back. Faces from war, screams from cages, smells he'd buried deep. But Shadow was always there, watching, grounding. Frank practiced his statement in the garage, staring into the dog's eyes. You were beaten, starved, thrown away, and you still trusted me. If the court can't see that as redemption, they don't deserve to wear the word justice. On the morning of the hearing, Frank placed a Marine Corps pin on his lapel, and with slow reverence, secured Shadow's vest. They were ready, not just to testify, but to bear witness. The courtroom was tense. Frank sat on the stand, Shadow by his feet, as the prosecutor asked him to recount the moment they met. He told the story of the grave, the whimper in the woods, the eyes that looked like Gunner's. The defense objected, but the judge allowed it. This is more than a dog, Frank said, voice steady. This is what happens when love meets cruelty and refuses to back down. When the accused was led in, Shadow's ears flicked back. But he didn't growl. He stood, tall, brave, silent, and the entire room leaned in. Frank ended his testimony with a simple truth. You threw him away, but he found someone who saw his worth. That's more than I can say for you. There were tears in the gallery. The judge stared at Shadow for a long moment before nodding. Thank you for your service. Both of you. When the gavel dropped, it felt like a door closing not just on the case, but on the pain. Frank walked out of the courtroom with Shadow at his side, reporters flashing cameras, microphones extended. He said nothing, but Shadow turned to the crowd and barked once, loud and clear. That night, Frank stood at Gunner's grave again. Shadow beside him, both quiet in the snowfall. He placed a small wooden plaque next to the headstone. It read, for the ones who stayed, and the ones who came back. He rested his hand on the cold stone and whispered, we did it, Buddy, I kept the promise. Then he turned to Shadow and smiled. And now we live. The wind stirred the trees, a soft howl echoing through the pines. Frank didn't flinch, he just listened. And in that moment, everything felt exactly as it should. Whole, honest, real. The winter began to melt around them, and as spring arrived in slow bursts of green, so did a new rhythm in Frank's life one he hadn't dared imagine just months earlier. Each morning began not with silence or grief, but with a ritual. Shadow nosing his palm gently, Frank rising with a quiet grunt, coffee brewing, and two bowls being filled. The house felt lived in again. Not a shrine to memory, but a space of healing. Shadow no longer limped. His scars, both visible and not, had begun to soften, and Frank walked without the weight that once bent his shoulders forward. Neighbors no longer whispered when they saw Frank. They called out his name, invited him to backyard barbecues, asked about Shadow, offered dog treats, and sent cards after the trial aired on local TV. One child, Clara, made a drawing of Shadow with a cape and gave it to Frank at the farmer's market. "He's a hero, like you," she said. Frank knelt beside her, choking back tears. "He's more than that," he whispered. "He's a survivor." He pinned the drawing on the fridge beside old marine photos, smiling every time he passed it. It belonged there, just like Shadow. He built a small wooden ramp in the backyard so Shadow could chase a toy without putting pressure on his back leg. It started as a way to help the dog exercise, but soon it became a game they played each afternoon. Frank would toss the toy, Shadow would fetch it, and both would sit in the sun until dusk. One evening, Ellie's youngest son asked, "Did he save you like Gunnar did?" Frank paused, looked at the dog sleeping at his feet, then answered, "He didn't just save me. He reminded me why I stayed alive." The boy nodded solemnly. He understood. Frank began speaking at shelters and VA centers across the state. Not just about Shadow's recovery, but about their shared journey. "Sometimes healing doesn't come through words," he'd say. "Sometimes it comes on four legs, with broken ribs and a steady gaze." Shadow would sit beside him, vest on, calm as ever. Veterans cried openly. Volunteers asked how to foster trauma dogs. Frank always told them, it's not about fixing them. It's about being there when they choose to trust again. That trust, he explained, was the real miracle. Hard-won, sacred, and never to be taken for granted. One afternoon, Frank received a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs. They had watched the documentary and wanted to honor both him and Shadow with a special commendation for service beyond the call. The ceremony was modest, held at a local park under the old oak trees. A small podium, a handful of folding chairs, and a plaque etched with both names. Frank accepted it with tears in his eyes. "This isn't just for me," he said into the microphone. "This is for every soul, human or not, who was thrown away and chose to keep going." Shadow barked once. Applause followed. Gunnar's grave became a place of quiet pilgrimage. People began leaving small stones, dog tags, and notes beside it. "Thank you, Gunnar," one read. "Because of you, another life was saved." Frank visited often, sometimes alone, sometimes with Shadow. He'd sit for hours, not in mourning, but in peace. He spoke aloud without shame now, telling Gunnar about the new walks, the people they'd met, the boy who was scared of dogs but sat beside Shadow for 10 whole minutes. "You started this," he'd say. "You made room in me I didn't know I still had." At home, Frank began writing. Not war stories, but reflections, memories of Gunnar. The moment he first saw Shadow's amber eyes, the trial, the cold morning in the woods. He wasn't writing for publication, just to remember. Shadow would lie beside him as he typed, the quiet click of keys filling the room. Writing helped him reclaim things he'd buried: his voice, his past, his place in the world. It was as if, with every paragraph, the fog lifted more. The trauma didn't vanish, but it loosened its grip, enough to let life back in. As summer bloomed, Frank received an invitation to speak at a National Canine Veterans Memorial event. He declined at first, unsure if he was ready. But Ellie encouraged him. "Dad, people need to hear this. You have something real, and that dog. He carries something sacred." Frank agreed, reluctantly. When the day came, Shadow wore a new vest, this one embroidered with gold thread. Gunnar walked so I could heal. Frank stood before a crowd of over 500 people, his voice steady as he recounted a moment that began in grief and ended in grace. When he finished, not a soul remained seated. After the speech, a woman approached him holding a leash. Her dog bore the same scars Shadow once had. She said softly, "I was going to give up on him. Then I saw your story." "I didn't." Frank knelt and petted the dog gently. "Good," he said, "because they don't give up on us." That night, as he lay in bed, Shadow curled beside him. Frank whispered, "We're not just surviving anymore. We're guiding." He reached over and placed his hand on Shadow's head. "That's legacy, soldier." The dog sighed and pressed closer. There was nothing more to say. By fall, Frank had started a small foundation, the Shadow and Gunner Project, to help connect trauma survivors with animals rescued from abuse and neglect. It wasn't big, just a website, a few volunteers, some local donations, but it was real, and it was changing lives. One veteran wrote, "I didn't leave the house for 6 months. Then I met a three-legged pit bull. Now we walk together every day. Thank you for reminding me I wasn't alone." Frank read that letter to Shadow under the stars and whispered, "One more saved, buddy." We're doing it. Their final walk of each day remained sacred. Down the old gravel path, past the woods, to the small gate near Gunner's grave, Frank no longer cried when he visited. He smiled. He spoke of the foundation, the stories, the kids. Shadow would sit quietly as Frank placed a hand on the cold stone and murmured, "You were the first to save me. But not the last." He always ended the visit the same way, "Watch over us. We've got work to do." Then, together, they would turn back home to Shadows in the dusk, walking as one. Frank's body began to slow as the months passed. The old injuries nagged louder, and some mornings came with more stiffness than strength. But Shadow never left his side. He adjusted to the new pace with grace, always pausing when Frank did, always looking back to make sure he was coming. The love between them was no longer just healing, it was woven into the fabric of their days. In silence, in gestures, in loyalty that didn't need words. And when the wind was just right, Frank swore he still heard Gunner running beside them. Not gone, just ahead. The final scene of their story isn't a moment of tragedy, it's legacy. A bench now stands at the edge of McPherson Woods, near the maple tree. It bears an inscription carved deep into the grain. He didn't just save a dog, he found himself. Locals sit there often. Some bring their dogs. Some bring their silence. And all of them feel something deeper than words can say, the shadow of a bond. A reminder that broken doesn't mean lost, and that sometimes the ones who come to us hurt are the very ones meant to carry us home. In the end, Frank wasn't remembered just as a Marine, or as a man who loved dogs. He was remembered as a bridge between war and peace, pain and healing, despair and hope. And beside every memory of him, there was always Shadow, ears alert, eyes soft, watching, waiting, carrying forward the mission they had forged together. Because love, when tested in fire, doesn't burn away. It becomes armor, it becomes purpose, it becomes story. And their story, Frank and Gunner and Shadow, was one the world would not forget. The house stands quiet now, but not empty. Volunteers from the foundation still visit, still keep it alive. Shadow, now older but just as proud, greets them at the door. He walks slower, rests longer, but his eyes carry the same depth they always did. When visitors ask where Frank is, someone always points to the bench and says, "He's still there." Every sunset, they don't mean it literally, but somehow, it always feels true. Love leaves echoes, and some echoes never fade. And so it ends, not with loss, but with continuity. A man gave a dog a second chance, and that dog gave a man the same. Their story lives on in walks taken, hands held, wounds healed. In every person who chooses compassion over fear. In every animal given a chance not just to live, but to belong. Because sometimes, what saves us isn't medicine, or prayer, or even time. Sometimes, it's the quiet presence of another soul who sees us broken, scarred, and still worthy. Just like Shadow did, just like Frank once needed. Just like they did for each other.